Good afternoon. Welcome to our webinar hosted by The Signatory. We are doing a couple things a little bit differently this time. I do have a poll up. So if you, as you tune in and start to kind of get oriented, if you would give us an idea of where you are in your year-end fundraising efforts by answering those 3 questions on the poll, I would appreciate it. And we're going to go ahead and get started. As you know, my name is Kristen Hammett, and we are talking today about keys to year-end fundraising across generations. I am really excited to dive into today's topic with you. But before we do that, I want to share with you some of what has been happening here at the Signatory. We have a new ministry services webpage that you will find at thesignatory.com. And you will look under, if you're kind of finding, okay, you've landed there on our homepage, where do you find ministry services? So go under the tab, Who We Serve, scroll down to Ministries, and you will see our new webpage. You will find there tools and resources to equip you, all of our past webinars and a link to others, as well as a link to our Facebook community. That is really designed to help you engage more with us and for us to help equip you better. I encourage you to become a member of our Facebook group, where you will find we have frequent updates, tips, tools, articles, as well as discussions. Our goal here at the Signatory Ministry Services is always to equip you in your donor efforts and to partner with you as you develop those donor relationships. All right, everybody take a deep breath. It's halfway through October. Giving Tuesday is just 6 weeks away, and December will be here before we know it. It is officially year end. I think today's webinar will help you immediately in your year-end efforts. And today's webinar is full of great information. I have reviewed it. Rory and I have gone back and forth. I've asked him some questions, and I truly think this will be very beneficial for you. I'm pleased to introduce to you our webinar guest presenter today. Rory Starks comes with a lot of experience. He started his career in nonprofit fundraising at World Vision, where he guided the organization over a large period of growth, and then later served as executive vice president for Food for the Hungry, again, where they saw unprecedented growth. Today, he works at Masterworks in the development of integrated marketing strategies for a wide variety of Christian ministries. So we are certainly privileged to have him join us today. Before I hand this webinar over to Rory, let me just review a couple logistical details that will be pretty much old hat to many of you who have joined us before. But know that my goal is always, first of all, to make this a conversation. Please ask questions as you have them. When you're looking at your screen, you'll see that Q&A tab in the bottom toolbar. Just type in your question as you have it. I want to make sure we get to as many of those questions as possible, so I will integrate your questions into my own questions as I visit with Rory over the next several minutes. If you have any other comments or questions that we don't get to, just know that I will do my very best to get an answer to you in a very timely manner, as this really is your time. We are here to serve you, and we want to answer the questions that you have to help you grow your ministry. So with that, I'm going to conclude our webinar poll. It looks like, Rory, as I get ready to hand this over to you, we have a lot of folks who are well underway with their year-end fundraising. Some look like they have completed it, and many have preliminary plans in place. And then it also looks like folks kind of are across the board as far as how much of their annual budget the year-end giving is responsible for, whether that is not really being sure, or it can account for a variety of percentages. And then finally, with those emails, which I know that we'll get to in our conversation, again, kind of across the board. So that gives you an idea, Rory, of where we are as we enter this conversation. So we look forward to hearing from you. Welcome.
Great. Thank you very much. It's great to have an opportunity to share. One of the downsides of having the background that I have and the length of time is that I have to be careful not to tell too many stories along the way, or we won't get through. So I will try to do that. At the same time, try to share stories that are helpful and relevant as we go along through the presentation. A couple things to note on the beginning here. At the beginning is that the primary focus of what I'll be sharing has to do with digital strategies. I know that, and from your survey results, that you've got most of your year-end work planning done, and which includes what you're going to send in the mail, and then obviously donor visits and that sort of thing. But there are still some opportunities potentially for you on the digital side. So I'm going to focus on that in this presentation. My background and experience, however, is much broader than just digital, and includes, I've had the opportunity to both be responsible for very large and complex direct marketing programs, and at the same time have the experience when I was at Food for the Hungry of having my own caseload of major donors, and so and working with some of our key foundations. So I have been blessed with a kind of a wide variety of experiences. And so if there are questions that come up through this time that we have together today, please, that don't have to do with digital, but may be prompted by something I say, whether it's direct mail or whether it's related to a major gift, don't hesitate to ask. I'll do my best to answer questions along those lines as well, should they come up. So let's get into it. One of the things everyone pretty much knows that the last quarter of the year is typically the best. The majority of the income comes in, or at least the largest percent of income comes in to a typical ministry. This statistic, however, it relates specifically to digital and specifically to the month of December. So we know that 31%, or nearly a third of your online income comes in the month of December. So it means that whatever you do online in that month is really critically important in a significant factor in your overall online income for the year. So it's important to remember that as we walk through this, that you have, because we're talking digital, you still have the opportunity to make adjustments and to refine what you're going to do at the end of the year on the digital side. One of the things that we've seen happen is the significant increase in revenue that's coming from digital sources, digital channels. It used to be that direct mail was the lifeblood of organizations generating new donors, and what we've seen is that as much as it pains me to say, because I've cut my teeth on doing direct mail, and back in the day when we would break even on first gift in direct mail acquisition. That is no longer the case. In fact, there are a lot of ministries now that when you look at the not just the short-term ROI, but if you look at the lifetime ROI from donors acquired through direct mail, many ministries are experiencing 2-to-1 or less lifetime ROI, which if you think about that compounded over the years, think about the implications that has on your overhead. And so direct mail is increasingly becoming a really untenable solution for acquiring donors. It does not mean, when I say that, it doesn't mean that you should abandon your current direct mail program at all. I'm not suggesting that, but I am saying that it's really important to begin to think about and to be increasingly proactive in in terms of digital strategies. We have some clients now that are fairly large ministries, and as many as half of their new donors are coming through digital channels now. 3 or 4 years ago, that was pretty much unheard of. Today, it's just becoming more and more the reality. And so it's really important to recognize that.
Rory, I have a question for you on that pie chart. I heard you say, so I look at this initially, and you're really speaking in terms of their first giving channel. So not direct mail overall, but this is talking about to acquire new donors. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay.
And it's kind of mixed, actually, because what we're seeing in acquisition is a shift towards digital channels, but we're also seeing increasing numbers of donors who are giving through digital. There are donors who get an organization's direct mail appeals all year long, but at the end of the year they give online.
Right.
And so it's really kind of a mixed bag. But yeah, we're seeing. I mean, everybody's experiencing increases in their, or I should say, most organizations are experiencing increases in their giving through their website and through digital channels. And I guess the main point here is that it's really two sides of the coin. One side is direct mail is becoming increasingly ineffective as far as actually acquiring donors, mm-hmm. and digital is becoming increasingly more effective, and so it's concerning to me, because I think about so many ministries that I interact with that are not being proactive enough about what they're doing in digital to acquire donors, and so it's important from the acquisition side of it, but it's also important from the cultivation side. One of the things that on the cultivation side, one of the things we've learned is that that donors need to be cultivated through the same channel that they were acquired. So, for example, if a donor's acquired through a digital channel, the most effective way to cultivate them and to maximize ongoing giving is to communicate with them through digital channels. You can't acquire a donor through a digital effort and then just dump them into the direct mail program and expect that you're going to maximize their giving. That won't happen.
Wow, great. That's a great nugget we didn't even talk about yesterday, Rory. Hey, yes. I'm gonna throw you something from left field a little bit, maybe left field from this presentation perspective, but certainly on the minds of those folks that have tuned in. And out of a dedication to making this their webinar, I do want to throw this question at you. How much impact do you think the tax law change will have on year-end giving?
Yeah, that's a good question.
That's a loaded question, right? In 30 seconds or less, can you answer that question?
Yeah. I mean, I can't, because I don't really have a crystal ball. But I think, generally speaking, Christian donors that give to Christian ministries are less impacted by the changes in laws and that sort of thing. I think their motivation for giving is different. So I don't know. I think it may have an impact, but I couldn't tell you by how much.
Right. Yeah. And somebody tuned in with that question, and just know that we do have a whole webinar we did on that last time. From a preparation perspective, but I think that really is true. We don't fully know, right? We're going to have to kind of wait till the year closes out and evaluate more what our anticipated impact will be versus what really happens. And I do think you're right that I think the Christian ministry sector will perhaps not necessarily adhere to what the global nonprofit market does. So
yeah, that's generally what we've seen, but things are different now, and so we'll just have to see.
Right. Absolutely. All right. Well, proceed, sir.
Thank you. So let me just start with talking a little bit about this. One of the things that very often happens is that, and we did talk about this yesterday. We talked about the fact that what's the role of intuition, and I sort of link intuition with the third point here, which is creative, meaning the creative kind of execution. And one of the problems, intuition is a great thing when it informs your what you want to test, but it's not a great thing when it comes to actually executing a new program or a strategy. And it really needs to start with analytics. We always say analytics should drive strategy, and so it's really important as you think about anything, not just year end, but your overall fundraising strategy. It really should start with analytics, and analytics really understanding donor behavior and historical response to various offers and to tactics and strategies from the past is really, really important, and it's the place to start. I shared yesterday, we were talking about this, and I talked about thank you calls. And we did testing years ago with child sponsors who got thank you calls. And on the surface of it, you'd say, it makes sense that you would call people that sponsor a child and just thank them for what they're doing and the difference they're making in the life of a child. And in almost every single case, what we found, because we did that in a very controlled test, what we found was that the thank you calls actually depressed subsequent giving from the child sponsors. And so there are things that you think make sense and creatively, intuitively, but they need to be informed. It needs to really be informed by the analytics, and then analytics really need to drive strategy. There's a principle called the 40-40-20 principle. And what that principle says is that 40% of your success is the offer, and 40% is the audience. And that can mean the way you do segmentation. It can mean what if you're doing direct mail acquisition, it can mean list rentals. But it's basically said, what that principle says, that 80% of your success is getting the right offer in front of the right people. And I would add at the right time. And so that's why this is important, to remember that it's really let analytics drive your strategy, let intuition guide your testing, but really focus on the analytics to drive strategy.
So I'm going to interrupt you for just a second there, Rory. I want to make sure that our listeners hear what you're saying, and that is, don't avoid calling your donors to say thank you, but instead really analyze what you're doing and test to make sure that it is effective.
Yes, absolutely. That's a great point. I was not suggesting that you not call and thank donors. Child sponsors are a unique group, and there are some. In fact, one of the things that one of the theories that we came up with for why that depressed giving was because they had very specific questions about what was happening with their child and in that particular community, and somebody who was just calling to say thank you wasn't equipped to answer all the questions. So so one of the things that we got out of that experience is that child sponsors, unlike a donor who is not really connected in as intimate a way as somebody who's sponsoring an actual child, is less likely to have a lot of detailed questions. And so, yeah, it's a great point. I'm not suggesting at all that thank you calls are not appropriate. It's just that the primary point is that whatever you do, to the extent that you can do a test and do it in a controlled way, that's the best approach, because sometimes the things that seem intuitively that make sense but the results are counterintuitive.
think that's a really great point, Rory. I was talking to my husband just about that today. I think that intuition should not inform strategy is really a great nugget we can all take away from this. So thank you.
Yeah. So let's talk about get into some of the specifics on what are the things you need to be thinking about during, and this is true not just of year end, but it's particularly true during year end fundraising. The first is an offer. I mentioned the 40-40-20 principle, and it's when you think about nearly half of your success is really getting a good offer together. Offer meaning what you're asking the donor to do. Most ministries know that when you have a matching grant or a matching gift, that tends to be more effective than a regular offer. And so it's important to spend time thinking through what is it we're asking donors to do, and to be specific and compelling in the offer development. Next is to think about think about when you're implementing a year-end plan or an annual plan. You've got to think about it from an integrated point of view. So it's thinking about how are all the things connected, both on digital, but also what you're doing in the mail. How is the mail? If you're sending mail to major donors, how does that integrate with what you're asking donors to do in personal contact? For example, one of the things that we've effectively done over the years is we'll do a mailing to major donors. We will actually reference the rep that is their major donor rep, and so that there's an integration even between the mail piece and the personal visit that the major donor rep will be making with that donor. And so it's thinking about from a donor point of view, being donor centric, and thinking about how are the things we're doing going to affect the donor, and what is it going to look like from their vantage point, and making sure that you think through all of the different touch points so that you have an integrated strategy and plan. One of the things that we know that we're Giving Tuesday is fast approaching, and one of the things that's really important to remember is that Giving Tuesday, while it is an event, so to speak, it's really the beginning of a season in a different way, and so it's really, not only is it important to start with an effective campaign for Giving Tuesday, but to realize that that's part of an extended campaign that goes through the month of December. It's really kind of the beginning of a campaign, and I'll speak more about that in a moment. So the idea is to leverage all channels. There's a principle that these days you have to be everywhere donors are. Back in the day, donors were basically reached by either mail, or if they ended up becoming major donors, then through personal contact. It was a lot easier to reach donors because it was there was a fairly narrow way to reach them. Today, you can reach donors through a lot of different channels in lots of different ways, and so it's really important. This principle of be everywhere your donors are is really important, and to make sure that your messaging is consistent across channels. One of the things that's become a game changer is this ability to place a pixel. And what I mean by pixel is it's a bit of code. You could think of it like a cookie, but it's to place a pixel on the landing page of a website. And what that allows you to do, it allows you to track the donor's behavior and what they do on the website. This can have advantages from the standpoint of integrating what you learn by tracking their online behavior, and how that integrates with your direct mail communication. And today, those things can now be integrated, so you can actually know which donors are doing what on your website, and that allows for lots of ways of targeting messaging. It allows for retargeting to people that have come to your website, and so it's an important development that's emerged in the last few years. So we talk about when we talk about digital. Digital means more than just your website, and we talk about it as a holistic experience across the entire digital landscape, and includes things like display advertising, social, what you're doing in Facebook, for example, video. And to the extent that you can use video, you should be. It's one of the most effective ways of engaging donors today. Native advertising. I think you see that when you go to, if you've been to a website and then you go on to the CNN website, and you notice that there's an advertisement for something that was that you had looked at on another website. That's basically what native advertising is. And then of course search, and it's having a proactive strategy for each of those channels on your as part of your year-end campaign.
Rory, can we pause here for just a second?
Yeah.
I know that when we first kind of started promoting this webinar, we really kind of talked about communicating across generations. So how do I reach effectively at your end that baby boomer, as well as the Gen Xer and potentially the millennial? Can you tell me, is digital media an effective tool or platform to connect with all of those different age groups?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Very great question. Yes, one of the things that advertisers have discovered is that messages that work for boomers tend to also work for millennials and a younger generation. Now, obviously, that would not be true if you were talking about like planned giving opportunity or something like that. But in terms of the consumer world, and what we're also finding in the nonprofit fundraising world, the messages that work, the offers and the messages that work the best for boomers are also effective with younger generations. So there's less concern. We have less concern today, let's say, than we did a couple of years ago about messaging. I think the principle is, if you get the messaging right for boomers, then it will work for other generations. The biggest difference, the biggest change we've seen is actually from the builder generation, the boomers' parents, who gave out of a sense of loyalty. They gave they gave smaller gifts to a larger number of organizations. They had very high trust in institutions, and that is gone. That generation is passing, and I mean respectfully. I mean that literally. I mean, but that generation is passing, and boomers, like millennials, want to be engaged. They want to. They give to a smaller number of ministries where they feel a sense of connection, a greater sense of connection, and they expect more from the ministries. They don't want to be treated like an ATM machine, and I'll talk a bit about that as we go on through this when we get to talking about content and the importance of content, but. Yeah, really, and the simple response to your question is, if you focus on getting great offers and great messaging and great stories for boomers, the rest will follow.
Great, thanks.
So this is just saying this is just looking at the another way of looking at the revenue, the spike that you get in December, and the importance of Google. If you have it, I think most organizations have a Google grant today, but it just speaks to the importance of having that, and it's just another arrow in the quiver to have in your fundraising toolkit. Now this is very interesting. One of the things that we know in direct mail, because we've done very controlled studies over the years, we know what the optimum frequency is for a direct mail cultivation program. And we know that because of the testing, we know that there's a point of diminishing returns. In other words, there's a point when you're sending so much mail that you're really not generating net income. And so the question is, in the digital space, what is the frequency of communication that is optimum when you're talking about emails, for example? And so what we've discovered, and we've kind of worked our way into this over a period of several years. What we've discovered is that we don't actually know where to cap off the frequency yet, because even with a very intense frequency of emails, we're finding that the result is positive. It's a positive impact on income. And so what you're seeing here is you're seeing that the green are emails that were sent to donors that were not asking for money. And this is during a period from November 22nd through December 31st. A lot of ministries today will send an email, for example, to go along with their direct mail appeal, which means that they might send as little as 1 or 2 emails during the same period of time. What we found is that we don't know what the upper limit of email frequency is yet, because we found that the increased frequency continues to generate positive ROI and have a positive impact on overall income. And so now what this does say is that and this is very interesting, that you see that the December 20th email that went out was not asking for money. It was a content email talking about the ministry, and engaging people, and it's one of the best performing from a revenue point of view. It's one of the best performing emails that went out during that period of time, and so even those that show less revenue were cost effective from an ROI point of view. So the idea is, I guess a takeaway would be, if you have, unless you have a very aggressive number of emails planned for the year end, that you probably should increase the number that are going out. If you're sending out 4 emails between, say, Thanksgiving and December, you could easily send a dozen, and more than likely will result in increased revenue. And as I said, we haven't determined what the upper limit is. I was meeting with somebody. I had lunch with somebody, and I actually work. Our agency's in the Seattle area. I work out of my home in Scottsdale, Arizona, and I was having lunch with somebody in Phoenix, and they I asked them what they're doing, the frequency of emails that they're sending, and at the year end, and they told me 26. And it didn't surprise me at all to hear that, because that's what we're finding as well, that kind of frequency is actually effective in generating positive revenue. So something important to think about, that you can still have an impact this year on giving if you really maximize the number of impacts that are going out in email.
Rory, I will tell you, this is one point that you brought up, that as I reviewed the presentation, I just still have a hard time wrapping my mind around this. So I have a question. Do you think that this increased email frequency is just in the context of year end? In other words, this is not necessarily something that we should go adopt in regular communication, but instead is really a truth that exists toward year end when our focus really is to put that year end revenue push in place.
You know, that's a really good question. Our experience thus far is really focused on year end. Your question though is really interesting, because the question is, could this level of frequency be sustained throughout the whole year? I don't know the answer to that. It's conceivable that it could be, but I don't really know. And just as we tested into this level of frequency, we'd have to test into an increased level of frequency through the balance of the year. And it does, the challenge, this is another thing we talked about yesterday. The challenge is content, because you can't just send it. The content's really important. So if you're sending things to donors, it has to be interesting. It has to be relevant. It has to be the kind of thing that somebody will want to open. And now, not everybody is opening every email. You had mentioned, you talked about getting so many emails and just hitting the delete button, and that happens as well. But you think about what kind of results do we get historically for direct mail acquisition? You could say, well, 99% of the people that got that didn't open the envelope at all, but certainly didn't respond. But that 1% of the people who did respond made the whole thing cost effective. And hundreds and hundreds of, well, maybe thousands of Christian ministries have been built on that 1% that did respond. So we don't know at this point what the implications are like for the rest of the year. Well, we do know that it's effective at the end of the year. Yeah. And but it's a great question.
So here's a question I think that kind of really coordinates with this whole slide here. The question is, can you describe the content of that December 20th email? And so I'll ask you to speak to that, but I also want to bring out the point that you just said, and that is that these emails are only as effective as their content, right? That remains the important piece here, is the quality of the content.
Yeah.
Critical.
I don't know the content of the individual impacts that are on the chart here. So I don't know. It's a great question, and I'll find out, and I'd be happy to let you know so that you can pass that information on.
That'd be great.
I'm going to make a note of it right now.
Yeah, I think it certainly, it looks to me like the evidence, though, in any of this kind of graph is that this was a repeated effort. The people were receiving messages over and over, and they reacted to this one, which certainly it is interesting to know, if it wasn't a direct ask, what the content was, perhaps a really compelling story of a client or impact. But there were repeated efforts to communicate. And oftentimes I think that in and of itself helps to gain traction.
Yes. Yeah. That's really true. One of the things that's important, and this is true online, but also offline communication, is engaging people in ways that are not always just asking for money. For those of us who have actually cultivated relationships with major donors, we know that you don't always go in and ask the donor for money. I learned that when I first started at Food for the Hungry, and I would visit with a donor, and I had donors tell me that the only time they hear from I won't mention the organization, but the only time they hear from the rep from this other organization is when they want money. I've had donors tell me that, and it's not just and it's true across the board, not just with major donors. We don't generally ministries don't do enough to engage people beyond asking for money, and so this is an example. And one of the beauties of digital is that you can do it cost effectively. It's a lot more challenging when you have to put a mail piece together and send it out, because now you've got a lot of expense associated with it.
Sure.
And so that's one of the beauties of digital, is you can do that, and you can do it cost effectively. All of these, I'll show you in a minute, the end result of all of this from an ROI standpoint.
Okay, Rory, as you're moving on, and I know you've got several slides to still get through, but here's a question that came in from a viewer, and that is, how do you suggest going about retrieving new emails before the year-end campaign to get in front of potential new donors? So how do I get some new emails to potentially solicit some new donations from new people?
Yeah. So is the question really about acquisition, like acquiring new donors? Is that?
Yes.
Is that? Yeah. Yeah. Well, there are lists that are available. That I know, like Salem has lists that are available for rental, and we have some clients where we've had good success. It's kind of a mixed bag, but it is possible to rent lists that are email lists and to use those as basically to prospect for new donors.
Okay. Thank you.
Yep, it's a tougher road to do that, and it really is. It's really critically important, as I mentioned earlier, to make sure that when you go out like that, you've got to have the strongest and most compelling offers, because it's expensive, and it's not as expensive as direct mail acquisition, but it's expensive, and nevertheless, and a lot of money can be wasted by not really paying attention to the fundamentals of offer development and that sort of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. I think also, and don't you think there's an opportunity with social media, particularly Giving Tuesday, to potentially acquire some new contacts with smaller donations? Just they're kind of doing the crowdfunding or the real quick social media gift, and then they could potentially send some follow-up emails and communication that way.
Yeah. That's true. The other thing that we're doing is we're taking and I guess the way to say it would be, we're creating a profile based on the organization's donors, and those then that are on Facebook. So we're in other words, we're looking at, we're cross-referencing, I guess you could say, the donor file that would get direct mail appeals and that sort of thing, with the Facebook, with their those that are fans on Facebook, and we're creating lookalikes, and so we're advertising to people that are not donors, but they look like they're donors on Facebook, and we found that to be one of the most effective ways of acquiring new donors. Even more so than renting email lists.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the email list is probably pretty cost prohibitive for some of those folks tuning in. So kind of finding an organic approach to that is, I think, a great solution.
Yeah, it's everybody, most everybody has a Facebook page and that sort, and they have a presence on Facebook, but to really maximize to maximize your Facebook presence, there needs to be it's a fairly sophisticated strategy, actually, to create the lookalikes and all that. But what I'm finding is that I'm seeing an increased number of ministries that have someone on their team that actually has the ability to do that. Not just relying on an agency to do that for them, but have that capacity on their own team. And it's one of the best. Honestly, it's the best. Today, it's the best source of new donors. Even the ones when I talked about the organizations that we have as clients, that half their new donors are coming in through digital. Most of that's through Facebook and this lookalike strategy. Okay, so the next principle is reduce friction, and one of the things we've learned back in the direct mail side of it is that you don't want to clutter the response device. You don't want to give a donor lots of decisions to make. I've seen sometimes response devices in the mail that have six boxes to check. And so what happens there is you get people to have to think too hard and to have to make too many decisions, and that always decreases response. And we found the same thing in digital. You've got to make it simple. You've got to have it's why optimization of your donation page is so important. You've got to keep it simple, and you've got to reduce friction, and not give the donor a bunch of decisions they have to make, or have to click through 7 times to get to actually give you money. And so that's really an important principle. Talking about the content. Again, one of the things that's become a challenge is in this content environment where content is so important. Ministries it's been historically challenging just to get resource, for example, to do direct mail appeals in a newsletter. It's going to become increasingly challenging for ministries to essentially become publishers of content, and so I think one of the things that I think we will eventually see is that ministries will have to hire people or a person on staff that whose job it is to create great content, because it's going to be the demands of the public for great content, and the importance of it is going to increase. And so that's going to become an important. I think we're going to see more and more of that as time goes on.
Rory, before you jump into the urgency piece, I do want to kind of circle back with that content. I know even here at the Signatory, that's a big focus, is continuing to kind of curate content and ensure that we are just staying on top of all the information that is out there. And in our information society, there's lots of information out there. So I think that one solution for those smaller nonprofits who may be tuning in is think about your volunteer base. I think a lot of times we think about whatever that program side, whether it's a food pantry or a pregnancy center or a tutoring group, that we've got the people actually doing the volunteer work, interacting with the client. But there is an opportunity to engage other folks with other skills. And so perhaps this is a staff person, perhaps it's a volunteer, but someone who can find out the stories of these people that you are serving through your organization, the ministry that you're doing, and really putting an impact story together. So helping to create that content for you to use in your marketing and development efforts can be a really critical function for any size organization. But I think it is something you can execute at really a variety of income levels or size levels, depending on the organization.
Yes, yeah, great point. One of the things that I didn't touch on yet is that so much of what I've seen ministries produce is what I would call institutional communication, and so we talk about in my previous life when I was at World Vision, for example, in that context, the temptation would be to talk about, we sent 17 trucks and this many tons of food and all that sort of thing, and donors actually don't care about that. In fact, there's some very interesting research that shows that the more you talk about statistics, the less people will respond. And so it's very interesting because so often we want to quote statistics to people, and as soon as we start engaging It's sort of like left brain kind of stuff. As soon as we start engaging left brain, response goes down. And so the idea is to develop content that's everybody loves a good story. You know, and everybody wants to know, if I give to you, how is this going to impact the life of somebody else? And so so to your point, if you have a volunteer who can actually do an effective job of kind of pulling out those kinds of stories, the people stories, the impact stories, that's an alternative to hiring somebody if you're not in a position to actually hire somebody to develop content. So it's great comment. Thank you. The other thing is urgency, and I would say authentic urgency, because there are I have seen some fundraising that is creating urgency that's not necessarily authentic. And so there are ways to create authentic urgency, to have deadlines and that sort of thing. And of course, year end is one of those that is very obviously there is a deadline, and it's a real deadline. It's not made up. And so this is just an example of that, in one case where we actually show like how many days left to the end of the year, and it's in real time. So it's creating a sense of urgency to motivate people to respond. The other key here is you language. I talked about this, and I alluded to this when I was talking about the institutional kind of, you'd say institutional centric versus donor centric. Donors really don't care that much about us as an institution. They do care about themselves, and they care about the impact that their giving has on the lives of real people. And so it's really important to use you language. We've actually done. We had an example of this. This was kind of a little bit of an anomaly because the results were so profound. But we very intentionally did a test of a newsletter that we'd taken on this newsletter, and we developed a version of the newsletter that really, the biggest change was emphasizing you language in the newsletter, and it performed something like 5 times better than this more institutional newsletter. So it's really important to think about using you language and thinking about that you're communicating with an individual. One of the things I've seen a lot of when there's not personalization, meaning using the donor's name, is that a letter will start with "Dear friends," and that's a violation of that principle, because the letter is really, you should be thinking about the letter or the communication. If it's digital, it's to an individual, it's to one person, and you language is really important in communicating that. And then measure and analyze. I'll show you some results to kind of explain that. We looked at this increased frequency that we talked about in the previous slide, and the number of impacts that went out via email. Some fundraising, some not fundraising impacts, and we looked at the impact year over year, 2015 to 2016. With that increased level of frequency, we wanted to determine if that increased level of frequency was resulting in an improvement in overall results. And what we found was that in fact, it was, and it did increase. It increased revenue, and it increased the number of transactions and engagements with donors. In each of the 3 campaigns, you'll see that these were 3 campaigns, and in each case, there was an improvement in revenue. The most notable, of course, was the first campaign that was done, but the subsequent 2 campaigns performed extremely well, and cost effective, as you'll see in. I'm going to skip ahead just to talk about this. We talked about Giving Tuesday. One of the things that it's really important is to circle back with the donor, the people that give, Giving Tuesday and report back to them, to affirm them, to report back, and to see that engagement as not the end of the experience, but the beginning of the experience through the end of the year. You know, there's a counterintuitive principle that the most likely person to give to your organization is the person that just gave. And it's just interesting because you might conclude that the person that just gave is probably not going to give again. Well, what's interesting is that they tend to be the more likely person to give again. So when you think about Giving Tuesday, you think about the people that give are the most likely candidates to give another gift before the end of the year, and that's really important to remember. And part of the equation that's really important is to report back quickly about the gift that they just sent, so that you've earned the right to ask for an additional gift before the end of the year. The end result of all of this in those campaigns that I talked about was triple the end of the year, the email revenue from the end of the year. Their overall online revenue increased, and the ROI for all the impacts that you saw on that chart, for all those impacts and the cost associated with those, the ROI return on that was almost 12 to 1. And of course, it changed the way that the organization is thinking. It changed the way that ministry is thinking about how to approach campaigns, the frequency of emails, the types of emails, not just fundraising, but really in great content and engaging people along the way. And that concludes the slides. And I think if there are any additional questions, I'd be happy to entertain those.
Absolutely. So I will kind of gauge that over the next couple of minutes. Thank you, Rory, for all of that information. My second time through the presentation, and I still took lots of notes. So I think there's really some great information there. I really love the part about just testing your intuition. What you think might work, test it. Even with this increased frequency concept, if you're skeptical, test it and see what might work for your organization. Certainly, there could be some differences in behaviors across organizations. So just begin to test some of the things that you heard here today, but let that data inform your strategy overall. So thank you so much. I appreciate your insight and your expertise. For those of you who are listening, if you have additional questions that come out of today's webinar, feel free to send those over to me on email, and I will do my best to get a good answer back to you. Our next webinar will be November 13th. We will be having Dave Davies, who's a gift planning advisor from Wycliffe Bible Translators. He's going to be joining us and bringing the perspective of one of you, a ministry development officer. So you have an opportunity now to help determine what he discusses. He's got a breadth of experience from a large ministry, and so he wanted to hear from you. What is it that you would like to hear about from him? So go ahead and answer that poll that's on your screen, and that will help inform us on which direction we will go on our November webinar. All right, as you close up your computer screen or move on to your to-do list for the rest of the day, think about what your key learning is from today. Is it the importance of an integrated plan across all those channels? Is it about the potential for Giving Tuesday and how it might impact December giving? Or is it something different? Whatever it is that your takeaway is, decide what your action step for your organization is and take it. I want to encourage all of you today. You are in a busy season, and we just shared a lot of information. You have heard me say this before, but it remains true. What I love most about development work, the development work that you are doing, is you are getting to see God's people connect to the work that He is doing. Ministry workers get the privilege of seeing that work day in and day out, and donors provide the means for it to happen. And you, as development officers, advancement coordinators, executive directors, and presidents, get to make that connection happen. Don't forget the privilege of the work you do. I know it can be a high pressure time. You can feel the intensity of year end, but trust the process. And more than that, trust the one who will provide for your work. Not your donor, but the Lord. Remember to check out the Signatory Ministry Services Facebook group for more resources and community, and mark your calendars for November 13th. Until then, God bless your ministry development work and your year-end planning. Thanks so much.